Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you would allow me to speak your words. God, I pray that people would look at what you have to say and would hear your heart. Help us to learn what you want. Help us to be encouraged, to be challenged, and to be humble. Thank you, God, for amazing, faithful people that we get to do life together with. I pray, God, as we open up this book, this chapter, that we would see you. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen. Have you ever been disappointed? When I was a kid, I was 7 years old, and I remember my dad promised to take me fishing. And I was so looking forward to it. I had a tackle box, I had a fishing pole, and I wanted to go so bad. The day of, my dad ended up having to stay at work, and he didn't show up. And I was disappointed. When I was 9, up until that time, my mom and dad were fighting, and they were arguing. And I remember the day that my dad left for good. That day is etched into my memory, and I could remember it as if it was yesterday. I remember where I was at. We were in the backyard. I was looking at the faucet, and I could see the water dripping, and I could remember the smells. And my dad promised me that he would never leave. He said, I'm not going to live in the same house with you, but I'm never ultimately going to leave you. And then eventually he started not showing up at the sporting events, and then he started not coming to get us so we could go to his house. And by the time I graduated, it had been 2 years since I had seen my dad. You see, something about the cumulative disappointment that really adds up. When someone disappoints you over time, you begin not to trust them. Tonight we want to look at three men who had experienced disappointment, but not just disappointment. They'd experienced disappointment over and over again. I can imagine, as I think of this particular story, Daniel and his 3 friends being in their hometown of Jerusalem. And the Babylonian army comes into their city, breaches the wall, comes to their house, and takes them into captivity. Or I can imagine them being disappointed. I can imagine a 5-month march as you're going off to a foreign land. I can imagine when you got there and they changed your name, made you study the occult, that you would be disappointed. And there's something about a cumulative disappointment that adds up. When somebody disappoints you over time, it makes it so that you have a difficult time trusting. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it. Has God ever disappointed you? I know sometimes we're not really comfortable asking that question about God disappointing us, but have you ever prayed something that didn't come true? I have. Last year, we had someone in our church, and they had cancer, and they were sick, and a bunch of us gathered together, and we worshiped, and we sang, and we prayed, and we poured out our hearts, and we believed with all of our hearts that God would heal that individual. And yet he didn't. Have you ever had something that you really wanted and something that was important to you, and when you cried out to God, he did not show up? There's something about disappointment that is cumulative, that adds up and makes it difficult to trust God. I want to ask you to think about something as we get started in Daniel chapter 3, and if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn there. Can God be trusted when he's let you down? Can God be trusted when he's let you down multiple times? I want us to read from the book of Daniel because it is an incredible passage. In fact, I'm pretty excited about what we're going to read tonight, and I think there's something very important that really relates to every single one of us if we pay attention and we're open to it. In verse 1 of Daniel chapter 3, we read these words. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. If you read back in chapter 2, there was this dream, and there was this image of gold, which is the head of gold, and then it had all kinds of things and the feet of clay, and this rock comes in chapter 2 and takes the feet out from under it, and I can't imagine where he would get this image, but here he decides that he would build an image of gold 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. That's 90 feet tall. That's 9 feet wide. Okay, if you think about it in terms of today, if you think about the statue in Brazil, it's bigger than that. If you think of the Hollywood sign, it's about 4 times bigger than that. It's the equivalent of 8 stories high. That's how big the statue is. And it's at least plated with gold. okay? In the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon, there's 3 different views that are kind of dominant about where that is. Some people think it's right inside the city. Other people think that it's about 6 miles outside of the city. I happen to be one of the people that agree with that. There's a specific location where archaeologists have found a place where there's a platform, and on top of that platform, there had at one time been a statue, and then there's this massive valley. We don't know exactly for sure where it was, but it's somewhere in the province of Babylon. I think it's about 6 miles outside of the city, and there's this massive statue. One thing that we know about Babylon is Babylon had a wall that was all the way around the city. It was 297 feet tall and 87 feet wide. And as Jeremiah prophesies about Babylon, he continually prophesies about how one day that wall is coming down, that wall is going to crash. And here Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image. I think it's of himself. I think he goes back to Daniel 2 and he tries to circumvent what God said, that God said there's only one kingdom that's going to last. There's only one king that ultimately is going to rule. And it unsettled Nebuchadnezzar, and he decided that he was going to unify everyone. And so what he did is he put in the plain a statue that was 90 feet tall. It was probably on a platform, so it was really big. He then summoned. So this king had a lot of power. He summoned, and here's who he summoned: the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. And he's trying to unify everyone under one specific world religion, which is kind of interesting. If you think of the satraps, they're the chief representatives. They would be people that would have rule over large territories. The satraps we get to see in chapter 6 were the ones that tried to entrap Daniel and ended up making sure Daniel got thrown into the lion's den. These were the ones that had all kinds of power. The prefects were military commanders. The governors were civil administrators of small people. And what we know from history is that Nebuchadnezzar would take and he would overpower countries. And as he overpowered them, he would put in charge of each city a governor. And if you go back and you read 2 Kings chapter 25, you get to see about one particular governor who ruled over there, and his name is Gedaliah, which is an interesting guy. Some history. Advisors, they counseled the king. Treasurers, they were administrators. Judges, they would make sure that the law took place. And then there was magistrates. These were sheriffs that kept the law. And then provincial officials. Basically, what we want to know, and it repeats this 2 different times, and then again, 4 of them get repeated a 3rd time, so it's super important. And here's what we know that's taking place. Nebuchadnezzar, in the province of Babylon, decides to have every single person that is official of all of the areas he's ruling, and has them all come to one valley. The best way I could describe it today would be like the opening ceremony of the Olympics. It is something that is majestic and powerful, and we know they had all kinds of music, and they had a spoken word guy that stood up and said some really incredible stuff. Let's read it. So the satraps, prefects, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, other provincial officials assembled for the dedication. It's the 2nd time we're reading about these people. And they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language. And what they did is they had conquered all kinds of other peoples. And the rulers and the governors came there to that place with this massive gold statue. And there's a herald talking, and there's an incredible event with all kinds of pomp and circumstances. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. So he summoned all the people and he said, we're going to play some music, and then you're commanded to do something. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, here's what you must do. You must fall down and you worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So what they're supposed to do is go flat on your face and make sure that your forehead touches the ground, and you're supposed to worship. I wanted you to see how important worship is to this particular passage. In fact, 12 different times it's about worship. It's about the worship, and Nebuchadnezzar is trying to get everyone to worship him and his God. And he has set himself up as if he is God. Verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Back in those days, it's not like we think of a little teeny stove or a little teeny furnace. It's not even like those big pizza ones where we see they have those stove furnaces where they cook pizza in it. Imagine a hill, and cut out inside the hill, there's this massive hole inside of the hill that they've cleared out. There's a hole on top, and then there's a hole at the bottom. It's probably between 20 and 30 feet wide, and this is what they would use to melt things down. And there's these burning furnaces, and you can see the flames coming out from the top, and then you can see, and then you can go and clear them out from the bottom. And what he says is, if any person, it doesn't matter what nation you are, where you're from, if you don't proclaim your allegiance, if you do not bow down, you will be immediately thrown into the furnace. I can just imagine the tension building. Here's Nebuchadnezzar there in front of all of these rulers, and then it gets worse. Watch what happens when the herald says this is what you have to do. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, watch this, all of the nations and the peoples of every language fell down and worshiped. And I can imagine these three guys. I think the reason that Daniel's not there is because he's in the palace, but that's a whole nother talk. Here are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are their real names, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and they're here in amongst all of these people. And they're listening to them talk, saying, I wonder what everyone else is going to do. And all of a sudden, they start playing the music, and everyone but them falls down to the ground. Have you ever felt peer pressure to go along with the crowd? I've seen it, I've watched it. Peer pressure is an incredibly powerful thing. It affects teenagers. They do some of the dumbest things. Not only is it powerful for teenagers, but it's also powerful for adults. And here's the entire crowd falling down, and there's these three people standing up. Have you ever compromised? Have you ever given in? I think they could have used all kinds of excuses. You know what? Everyone else is doing it. Hey, if I don't go along with it, I'm going to die. Hey, I have to do this because I am under the rule of someone else. And everyone else is laying down, and here these three people are standing up quietly by themselves. At that time, some of the astrologers came forward, denounced the Jews. Astrologers is the same word for Chaldeans. That's what they did, is they studied astrology. But I think in this particular sense, what's going on is these were the people from Babylon, the people that were naturally there, and there was all these other languages. And remember in chapter 2, when Daniel came and interpreted the dream, Nebuchadnezzar set up Daniel ahead of everyone. And then he set up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as administrators in the province of Babylon. And these people who had been Chaldeans or Babylonians, and they had watched these three guys get elevated over them, experienced jealousy and probably racial hatred, and they were upset, they were mad, they were frustrated, and what they did is they denounced the Jews. That's a word that's like trying to crush or tear down or really undermine these people. They said to the king, may the king live forever. I don't want to go too fast. There's a slide that I must have got an earlier one, didn't get in there, don't worry about it. But there are some Jews who you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And here's the three charges. They don't pay any attention to you. They don't serve your gods. Here's the third time we see that word. They do not worship the image of gold that you have set up. They were accused of three crimes. They were accused of having absolutely no respect for the king. We're going to think about that as we go through the text to see if that's actually true. They refused to serve the gods of Babylon, and they refused to worship the golden image. This thing is super touchy. There we go. I find it very interesting to consider what the three men didn't do. Okay? They didn't make any speeches, call attention to themselves. There was no attempt to stop others from bowing down. There was no demonstrations, no violence, no resisting arrest, no running away, no lying about their actions, no request for amnesty, no attempt to overthrow the king. They didn't do any of that stuff. and they were accused of disrespecting the king, of not worshiping the image and not serving their gods. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. And as I was processing, why in the world was he so furious? Why was he so mad? I think he's mad because the people that he just promoted are dissenting. And back in those days, the king did not put up with anybody dissenting. And we kind of know from the rest of the passage that Nebuchadnezzar didn't buy into the lie that they were disrespectful or anything like that. He is just furious that these people have the audacity to go against him or even question him. This guy has such an incredible ego that he literally builds this 90-foot statue, or at least the statue on a pedestal is so big you can see it from everywhere. And every time someone sees music, they have to bow down to this guy. Watch what he says. He comes up to them and he summons them. He does a lot of summonsing, we're going to read. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, which is their real names. These men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, and at first he kind of has a calm, probably a fatherly tone. He cares about these guys because he sees that they're 10 times smarter than everyone else. That's what we learned from chapter 2. And he says to these guys, hey, is it true? Hey, I want to make sure that these guys aren't just trying to undermine you because you're in charge of them, and I want to make sure to see what happened. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my God or worship the image? He is so dumbfounded at the thought that anyone might even question that. You see, everyone else immediately bowed down. This guy was used to getting what he wanted immediately. I got a little taste of this when I was younger. I was probably about 30. And I got to work at the house of a 4-star general. And this 4-star general was used to giving orders, and he was used to getting what he wanted. And when I came over to his house, he started talking to me, and he said this to me. He walked up to me, and he said, "You will be here tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. And I said to him, unfortunately, I have class tomorrow at 7 o'clock. I'd be happy to come Wednesday or Friday. He took another step towards me and kind of looked down at me, and he said, you will be here tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And I said to him, I'd be happy to be here Wednesday. I'd be happy to be here Friday, but I can't make it tomorrow. And I thought this guy was going to lose his mind. He had not had anyone say no to him. Imagine someone way more authoritative with more power than him saying to these guys, is it true? How in the world could you even consider not serving my God and worshiping the image that I have set up? Watch what happens. Now, he changed from a fatherly tone to a more stern tone, and I can imagine him saying this. Now, I'm going to play the music again. I don't normally do this for anyone else, but since you're 10 times smarter than everyone else, I'm going to play the music, and I'm going to go through it. And as soon as we play, all you got to do is bow down, and you worship. Everything's cool. Don't worry about it. All you do is worship me right here, and everyone will know, and everything's great. But if you do not, immediately I am throwing you in the blazing furnace. And I can imagine the tension burning, because at first, here these guys are listening to the story. And then they get turned in. And then they can see that intensity on Nebuchadnezzar's face. And he is serious. And he says, immediately, if you do not bow, you are going into the flames. And I can just sense that they can see right over the hill this furnace that's burning. And they can smell what's going on in there. And they know, because this is an egomaniac with a temper, and he doesn't put up with insubordination at all. You see, there's something else that I think we're missing, because most of us that have read this story know the rest of the story. And because we know the rest of the story, we miss the tension of what is actually happening at this moment. Did you know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't have any promises from God? They didn't have any angels speak to them. They didn't have any voice from heaven coming down saying, hey, if you stand up for me, I will protect you. And remember that the last time they desperately needed God. When the Babylonian army breached the walls, and I can imagine they were praying, God, please protect us. And when they needed God the most, he wasn't there for them. And here these guys are standing up to this authoritative, egomaniac dictator saying, either you get on the ground and you bow down right now and worship. It's kind of ironic that the reason that they were in captivity was because they had decided to worship idols. And here these three men are, not knowing the outcome. I want to slow down because last week in the homework, in the book, I pointed out, and I gave you a chance, and I would encourage you to take some time to do the homework. So if you're looking at this online and you have the book, you can get a digital copy of it on our web page under Adults, under Studies. And what I said was that this was inverted parallelism or chiasm. And in chiasm, you start with A, you end with A, you go to B, then you have B, then you bring it down to C, and then the main point is in the middle. Not only is the main point in the middle, but this is the narrative arc where you build to the crescendo after that. Not only is that, but the author wants to make sure every single person catches what's being said, because this, what we're about to hear, is the only word spoken by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the entire Bible. So here we're about to hear the only words they say at the main point, so we do not miss the message. And do not miss the tension, because these men are before a dictator that is not used to anyone ever saying no. And he says, if you don't do it, you are in the furnace right now. Shadrach, this is the main point, these verses. So I want to slow down and we're going to capture this, okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves in this matter. And some people think you're being disrespectful. Basically, they're saying there's no reason even putting up a fight, because what we did was exactly what you said we did. The second two, we didn't bow down, we didn't worship. In essence, we're guilty of it. We did not bow down, we did not worship. Watch what else they do. This is the second thing they did. Verse 17, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, and here's, can you imagine these young men having this kind of courage? If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. God is able, and he will do it. But I want to get down to the heart of it, to the point, to the main idea, because this is where it's crucial. This is where the rubber meets the road with us. Verse 18. But even if he doesn't, even if he doesn't. You see, if someone's disappointed you repeatedly, the cumulative effect makes it difficult to trust. And here these three young men are, and they've cried out to God, and he hasn't been there. They said, God, we need you, and they still went into captivity. They were drugged on a 5-month march. Their identity was taken away and their names were changed, and they studied the occult, and here they are, disappointed in God. They believe God is able, but they're not sure he is willing. And that's exactly where some of you are. Some of you have cried out to God and you've said, God, I need you. Some of you have laid out your heart before God and you said, God, this is what I desperately need. And at the crux, at the moment, this is what they say. Even if he does not. God, he said it to Nebuchadnezzar, even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down and we're still not worshiping you. We are not bowing, we are not worshiping, and even if our God doesn't step in and deliver us, I think that a lot of people have missed the main point. The main point is not this. If every single time that you obey God, He promises to deliver you and nothing bad will ever happen to you. I think the main point of the passage is this, is that even if God has disappointed you in the past, He will honor your faithfulness. Sometimes God protects us from the fire. Sometimes God protects us in the fire. And sometimes God doesn't ultimately reward us until after the fire. And here these guys are at the crux, at their moment. They are scared, they're nervous, and they don't know 100% sure that God is going to step in and deliver them, and they have the faith to do it anyway. I don't want you to miss this, that faith in God doesn't mean you don't have doubts. Faith in God means in spite of your doubts, you're willing to trust Him and be obedient to what's right, even when there's uncertainty. Even if He doesn't, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods, we will not worship your image, the one you've set up. The one that's majestic and amazing, and even though everyone else did it, we are not doing it. Now, the king was mad before. Now he is furious. The Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He went from a fatherly, affectionate tone of, hey, everything's going to be okay, just bow down now, to where he wasn't in any way receptive or available. He was demanding, and he was irritated to the core. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, other clothes, were bound and thrown into the furnace. And I can imagine he said, get them now, and he took his best and his most intense soldiers, and he said, you get them in there now in front of everyone, because I'm not putting up with this. And they were fully clothed, they were drug in, and at the top of the hill with the flames going in, they tossed them into the furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men firmly tied into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors. This is the part where it gets cool, because God steps in and He's about to do something cool. Is God worth following if He doesn't produce the outcomes you desire? Are you willing to trust God even when He disappoints you? Or are you only in it if you get what you want? You see, these 3 men had the courage to follow even though they didn't know the outcome. And I can imagine the terror as they're getting dropped into the fire and they're watching the strongest soldiers die. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men tied up in the fire? Or certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And I can imagine Nebuchadnezzar going, what in the world's going on? I bet he ran all the way around the hill, and he's looking in from the bottom. And he's kneeling down so he can get a really good view. And he's looking up and he's going, what is going on? They're not burned up. There's 4 men instead of 3 men inside the fire. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. This is so cool. I can imagine Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saying, okay, we'll come out. Something to think about, and this is only the weird things that my mind goes through. What do you think the conversation was with the one in the fire who might be an angel? I think it was Jesus. Chapter 2, Jesus was the rock that came and set everything up. And here, Jesus is the rock that ultimately protects us, and nothing, even death itself, can keep us from him. The satraps, prefects, governors, this is the time that we get to see all these people, royal advisors crowded. These are the really important ones, okay? They saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. Has anybody ever been to a campfire? Trust me, you even get within 20 feet of a fire, and there is the smell that you can't even get out until you wash the clothes. I would have loved to have been in the fire. I wouldn't have loved to have been thrown in the fire, but I would love to have had the experience of the fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." You see, God doesn't always protect because God has bigger picture than we do. You see, God is always working towards his glory and our ultimate good. And often, our ultimate good isn't our immediate comfort. And I know that goes against every fiber of everything inside of us Americans. Watch what Nebuchadnezzar said. The God of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants, they trusted him, and they had the courage to defile me. The king's command were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their God. These guys had the courage that even in the midst of their fear were able to stand up. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation, language, who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut in pieces and thrown, their houses be turned into a pile of rubble. This guy hasn't changed at all, right? I'm still in charge, and you're going to have to worship this God now. I think three cool things happened. One, he had the second layer of influence over Nebuchadnezzar. First, he said that after he saw the dream that he's the one that reveals mysteries. Now he says no one else can do this. So he was in the process. We're going to find out in a couple chapters later how that actually chapter 4, where he refuses to submit and God tells him that something's going to happen to him, and then eventually he has to become a wild animal before he follows God. He hasn't followed God. That's one thing. Second thing is God is protecting all of the Jews. Now all of them are able to worship God because it's illegal to say anything against them. So sometimes God has bigger pictures. And we're about to see that he rewards them. For no other God can save in this way. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar said, "What God can protect you from me?" And Nebuchadnezzar thought that the God of Israel was no match for him. But in all reality, Nebuchadnezzar was no match for the God of Israel. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Are you willing to trust God even when he disappoints you? You see, in week 1, we learned this, that God honors those that honor him. In week 2, we learned that there's only one king and there's only one ruler that ultimately will last. And this week, we learned that God will ultimately protect you. But it might include some disappointment because he has bigger pictures than you do. One last thing before I end is this verse and these verses is not an example of how to stand up against rulers. Okay? This is not saying that if you have a rule that you don't like or something that's inconvenient for you, then you have every right to defy the governors. There may be other passages that talk about that, but that isn't what this passage talks about. As I get ready to close out and end this talk on Daniel, I want to ask you that question I started with. Can you trust God even when he disappoints you? And can you trust God even when he disappoints you more than once? Dear God, I pray. I wished it wasn't true, God, but I wished I could say that we live in a world where we'll never have to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But God, it might come to the point where what we do is illegal. It might come to the point where we are told we can't evangelize in public. It might come to the place here, like it already has in other countries, that if we stand up for what you say about sexuality, that will be a hate crime. And God, I pray that you would give us the wisdom, discernment, grace, gentleness, and courage to take a stand and do what's right, even if it costs us. God, I pray that we could trust you, that you are the only one that can ultimately protect us, even though we don't get promised the outcome. Give us the courage, God, to follow you with all of our hearts and to faithfully obey, because that's who you are. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen.